Okay, in this second video about the Renaissance, I will examine more specifically changes in the artistic content. And my point in part B will be to show how much the new arts were inspired by humanism and all these philosophical principles of early modern times. And first of all, let's see how much the artists were inspired by Greek and Roman antiquity. So probably the field of arts where the influence of antiquity was the most obvious was architecture. Indeed, the artists of the Renaissance totally rejected the art of the Central Middle Ages that they viewed as something barbarian. That is the reason why they invented the term Gothic art, which in their minds was a negative expression, almost like an insult. And in fact, during the Middle Ages, this form of art that we today name Gothic was named French work, and it had been extremely popular, in particular in the north of France and in the north of Europe. The Strasbourg Cathedral can be seen as a good example of this medieval art, which was based on a kind of profusion of details and a great complexity in architecture. And I think this cathedral is a good example of this. And I would like you to have a look at the sculpture on the left, because it is a theme, the adoration of the Magi, that we will find on other Renaissance artworks. So on the contrary, the architects of the Renaissance, they wanted to rediscover and to promote again some principles of the architecture from Roman and Greek antiquity. Here is the Pantheon in Rome, which was made during the 1st century before Christ, and where you can see some very specific elements like the columns, like this triangle above the gate, which is called a pediment, or the presence of a dome in the background. But all these elements are things you can see as well on this 16th century house named Villa Rotonda. It's in Venice, which was made by an architect called Palladio, one of the most symbolic, iconic, I would say, of the architects of the Renaissance. And you can see all these elements present again. Another example would be St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, with its very, very impressive dome and all those rows of columns. One thing which is clear is that the principles that the architects of the Renaissance praised were symmetry, the harmony of proportions, and a certain regularity. They did not only make religious buildings, they also made civilian buildings like this palace, Palazzo Farnese in Rome, where you can see a good example of this attachment to regularity and symmetry of proportions. Another field of art in which influence of antiquity was strong was sculpture. We can say that the influence was in the techniques and the materials. For example, Donatello was the first sculptor of the Renaissance to make a bronze statue, and it shows the figure of David for that. And that is something that used to be done in antiquity but had been forgotten in the Middle Ages. Another famous David of the Renaissance is the one made by Michelangelo, which is absolutely gigantic. And another thing that I think is obvious with these two examples is how much human nudity became again an important subject of art. And for 1 millennium it had been totally forgotten during the Middle Ages, because the Catholic Church did not want human nudity to be put forward this way. One last point about the subjects. Something that was very frequent not only in visual arts but also in literature, for example, during the Renaissance, was the use of subjects taken from Greek or Roman mythology. For example, this extremely famous painting by Botticelli shows the birth of Venus, which is taken from the Roman mythology, of course. Next point is the objective that Renaissance artists had to imitate nature as well as possible. During the Middle Ages, the representation of reality was perceived as something trivial, almost vulgar, and artists only wanted to represent religious things and symbols. Progressively, reality came back in a way. It was something rather progressive, but depiction of things like drapery or nature, human bodies, houses, was something that was more and more the focus of the artist. So I chose this example, which is one of my favorite Renaissance paintings. I think it is fascinating. It is a very small painting made by the painter from Flanders, Van Eyck, and as you can see, it's a very early painting, 1433, 35 more exactly. So we'll talk about the subject a bit later, but I think this one is a painting in which you have all the great new techniques that permitted the artist to imitate reality. Of course, one of the most famous and extraordinary improvements in Renaissance painting was the development of techniques to give the illusion of depth, and it's what we call perspective, and perspective was made possible by various techniques, but the most important of all is probably the technique of the vanishing lines, okay, which are these lines that should be the lines showing depth, and the key idea is that they should cross at one single point that is called the vanishing point. Okay, you can see that very clearly on the Madonna of Chancellor Rollin, but Van Eyck on this painting also used other basic today, but mathematical perspective, which means that the further away an element should be in reality, the smaller it is on the painting. So a good example of this is given with the two characters in the background here, or more exactly in the middle distance, because you really have different grounds on this Van Eyck painting, and the details of the landscape in the background are extremely tiny, and that is really remarkable. At the very background you may see some mountains which are not very clearly drawn, and precisely this is what we call atmospheric perspective. Something that is very far away should be like in a kind of haze or fog. Anyway, the artists of the Renaissance were people that did not separate art from techniques, and they were all good technicians. Some of them were even engineers or scientists, and they made no difference. They used all their skills. One thing that would be wrong would be to call this art realistic. The art of the Renaissance is not realism. It shows reality in a more accurate way, for sure, but it often showed reality much more beautiful than it was. When it comes to showing beautiful things and drawing things in a prettier way than they are in reality, I think Raphael is one of the best examples. Maybe Raphael was the best drawer the world ever saw, and you can see on this representation of the Holy Family, which means the family of Jesus with Mary and Joseph and all their mates and cousins. You can see how perfection is here expressed. So very rare were the artists that dare to show the ugly side of life. There is one famous example though, so a kind of counter example. It is this famous portrait of an old man and his grandson, which was made by a painter who is not one of the most famous, but it's in the Louvre Museum, and it's something that is very well remembered today. Last point, in the focus that was chosen by the artists, what they really wanted to show, I think it's important to note that there was a greater focus on humanity. Of course, there is no real breakup between the art of the Middle Ages and the art of the Renaissance when it comes to subjects. The subjects of paintings were still very religious, because this is what the people wanted. It was still a very religious period. The Christian faith of the Europeans was still very strong, and the Catholic Church was still very powerful. So most of the Renaissance paintings are religious subjects, that's true. But in religion, in a way, becomes secondary, because through these religious subjects, what the painters could now show was human life, human things, human bodies. Take this example. This is a Virgin and Mary painting. It means it shows, no, not Virgin and Mary, sorry, Virgin and Child. The Virgin Mary and his child, Jesus. So here they are on a medieval painting by one of the most famous medieval painters called Cimabue, an Italian. And, well, you can see there is not a lot of nature here, not a lot of humanity. The faces are rather expressionless. There is no individuality in many of those faces, maybe with the man in the bottom a little bit, okay? And if we compare that with the very famous Virgin and Child, but by Leonardo da Vinci in 1503, you can see that the subject is the same in theory, but in reality it's not a painting about religion at all. Religion is almost absent from this painting. It's a painting about love between a mother and a child. Everything is in the look of the characters. They are not staring at the viewer like in Cimabue's painting. They are looking at each other, and they are looking at each other with love and tenderness. So of course it's not a painting about God. It's a painting about human feelings. And some paintings were absolutely not religious. This was new as well. They were rare, but they existed. Portraits multiplied in the Renaissance, because this is what people wanted. Rich people, of course, but not only nobles anymore. For example, in very rich urban Flanders, the Arnolfini portrait. Arnolfini was a merchant, and he had this portrait made by Van Eyck. We saw that the other day. There is nothing religious in that. To conclude, I would like to go back to this painting of Madonna of Chancellor Rollin, also by Van Eyck, because I think all the Renaissance is here. All the paradox of the Renaissance is present here. This is a religious painting, okay, because you have the Madonna, that means Virgin Mary, and you have Jesus and an angel. So Chancellor Rollin is somebody that really existed. He was the one who paid for this painting, and so because he was a Christian, he wanted to go to heaven, and so paying Van Eyck for a beautiful painting of the Virgin Mary and Jesus was probably something that he viewed as useful for his own salvation. But because he was also a man of the Renaissance, of modern Renaissance, he wanted a painting which would celebrate his own individuality. And so he is also on the painting. It is both a portrait of the Virgin and a portrait of Chancellor Rollin, a very rich and powerful noble of the beginning of the Renaissance. And I think in this painting you really have all the elements of this fascinating period from a cultural point of view.